welcome back to Fish Hunt Northwest. We're here in the bait lab. We're going to talk a little bit about rigging up for so you can be successful when you're pursuing chum. Now, a lot of folks would argue the fact to say that, you know, chum isn't the best table fare. I'd have to agree when it comes to talking about which salmon typically are best for table fare. But, you know, they do have substantial amount of oils in them. They do actually smoke up pretty well. But as far as having a day on the water and fighting fish until your arms get tired, there's a number of ways you can go after them. In a drift boat or in a sled, either or, sitting on anchor or moving down river, putting plugs out wrapped with sardine or tuna, something like that, is a definite go-to because it's just so doggone effective. These chum are very aggressive, and you rattle a plug in front of their face, they're going to strike it. If you're moving downriver and getting out bank fishing, or you're just actually walking the bank fishing, you know, bobber and jig method for chum absolutely works fantastic. There's certain colors that they really respond to over the years. I've basically fine-tuned my arsenal to just select those colors because I know under certain water conditions it's going to flat out produce time and time again. So let's break it down from the start. This is basically one of my older, heavier rods. It's a 10.5 foot, 10 to 20 pound. It's the old Vetter Lama glass rod. Love this rod. Use it pretty much exclusively for two things: bobber and egg fishing for Chinook, and or if I decide to go bobber and jig fishing for chum. I don't recommend using an 8 to 12 pound rod, an 8 to 17 pound rod, a 6 to 15 steelhead rod. You're asking for trouble. You can do it, but I tell you, if you're out here on the coast and you get into some of those bigger Chinook in that 20 pound class, which does happen, you're going to have a fight on your hands. And if you're not planning on keeping a lot of these fish, you don't want to have a half an hour fight on your hands. You want to get those fish in relatively quick, release them unharmed so they can go do their thing. So 10.5 foot, 10 to 20 pound rod is going to get it done. Again, the length of the rod, especially if you're bank fishing, where we're float fishing, because we are trying to keep our line for the most part off the water. I got a heavier duty reel on here. This has at least a 22 pound to 25 pound drag. All of this is conducive to being very effective for catching chum. I have probably 50 pound braid on here, which if you've heard me talk before, on my bigger level wines, I like to put that 50 pound braid. Not that I need the tensile strength of 50 pounds, more so that the line doesn't get buried down into the spool if I do get hung up or I have to pull real tight against the line. Thinner line on baitcaster or level wine style reels, once you hang up and pull that tight, it's going to find its way down inside that spool, and it makes it really tough to get out of there. So a little bigger diameter, it floats on the top of the water really well. You're going to be happy with a large diameter. Onto that I tie, now we're talking chum, so I'm actually putting on a 25 pound top shot of, you know, for me it's Ultra Green by Maxima. It's a very durable line. It's going to get the job done. Use a good solid knot. I run about 12 to 18 feet of monofilament top shot, just because throughout the day as you trim and change gear and work your way up that line, you're going to still have plenty of line left to fish your presentation vertically and not run out of top shot and always have to retie it. So I go 2 to 3 arm lengths is going to be 12 to 18 feet. That's going to get it done. So my float is going to slide up and down on my monofilament. You guys have seen me talk about bobber fishing before. Anytime it's a vertical presentation, I'm fishing a top shot, and my bobber stop, my Bomac bobber stop, these little egg stoppers, these rubber ones, grab really well on monofilament. So that is why I place these on my top shot. You just simply slide it on the line, and depending on the depth of your water is how you're going to set the depth for your float. So if I slide it down towards the presentation, it makes it a shallower, or you're fishing not as deep. And if I run it up towards the rod, that's going to deepen my presentation overall. So you can adjust that little tiny stopper, which is everything, you know, your indicator and your float that I'll get into here, stops against, and that's the depth you're going to fish. So what do I mean by indicator? For me, when I'm fishing vertical especially, or even when I'm bobber dogging, I place on top of my float, I'll use a cheater, like a size 12 cheater of a different color than my bobber, so that from the shoreline or out of the boat, when this actually drops to the bottom, or that weight from the jig or my inline sinker pulls through, I am for certain that I am fishing my depth maxed out to where I set it. Sometimes bobbers can get a little edge on them or something, or your grommet can start to break down and that line might stick. And if I don't have an indicator on here, I may not actually be fishing as deep as I had planned to, and I won't even recognize that because my float will actually be vertical and the line will just be laying down, and I'm not going to see that little stopper from back on the shoreline. So if that is laying in the water, that tells me that my depth is not maxed out. Anytime I'm fishing, I want to make sure that that indicator is straight up and down on top of my float, okay? So now I know I've achieved depth, and I can adjust that to whichever depth I need depending on the depth of the water. For jig fishing for chum, I'm going to run a little bit bigger, girthier jig. I want a stout 1/0 or a stout 2/0 hook, and that's either going to be a 1/4 ounce jig or even a 3/8 ounce jig. I don't necessarily need to go to a 1/2 ounce jig. That's pretty heavy. I like to use those if I'm twitching for coho and chum, but for fishing vertical jigs, I'm going to go ahead and scale that down to most of the time a 1/4 ounce with a stout 1/0 or 2/0 hook. So with that, I'm not running my 1 ounce float. I'm going to scale that down to a 3/4 ounce float, and underneath that I'm going to run a 5/8 inline sinker. This is again just one of our Bomax sinkers. And something else I like to do, and you guys have heard me say this before, I like to put that little stopper bead or that rubber stop under or below the sinker, and I butt that right against the swivel on the weight. That is because if this knot was to break, in other words, if it breaks at the top shot and doesn't break at the leader, I lose the weight, I lose the jig, I don't lose the float, because that little stopper is going to keep the bead and the float from actually exiting the line. So that's why you put that little extra one right above your swivel. So that one goes tight there, and I didn't mention it before, but I kind of did. The float is going to stop against a stopper bead. Put like a 6mm bead below your float, then your stopper knot, and then your inline dual swivel on your vertical weight. Again, 3/4 ounce float, 5/8 inline sinker to a 1/4 ounce jig. And here's the colors, okay? Predominantly, you're talking purples, pinks, blacks, cerise. And as you look at this jig color, tied, of course, by Inglin Jigs, he's got a little flashaboo in there, little crystal flash. Really nice combination of purples, cerise, black, pink head. That's a chum getter every single day in water with clarity of 3 feet or more. We can get down to a little smaller scale if we want. Still got a 1/4 ounce jig head. I got some rabbit fur on here, but the pink, rabbit fur, and black underlie combinations. Here is a 3/8 ounce jig head with a little bit of pink. Again, pink rabbit fur, some white. All these with the pinks and the purples and the blacks and the contrasting colors, all these are going to work really well. Now you can do yourself a favor. You can fish jigs all day long for chum, and you're going to have pretty good success. But one thing that I definitely like to do is tip your jig with a little something that's definitely going to get their attention, okay? So once this is wetted down and you can get access to that hook, it's pretty simple. I like to buy the small or the extra small, raw, peeled, tail off, ready to cook raw shrimp. Okay, these are your tiger prawn. Get them in all your grocery stores. I actually just bought a bag yesterday of the extra small, which is a 100 to 150 count or 100 to 125 count it might be. It was under 10 bucks, and it's 2 pounds of shrimp, which is going to last you probably through your entire steelhead season as well, because this jig tipping method for chum also carries over, albeit on a smaller scale, but it works very well for steelhead as well on your jig. So look for your raw, small, or extra small shrimp. You can get the cooked ones, they're a little tougher, but I think these uncooked ones just have a much better natural scent to them, and I think the fish actually respond to them a lot better. So that's all we're talking about. It's got a natural presentation to it. It's just raw meat. It's actually durable just as it is, but there's a couple things I like to do when I get these ready for fishing the night before. I got a couple different products here. I got Pautzke's Fire in the pink, which adds a nice little color, and you don't want to use a whole lot of it. You're just barely dusting these things. Other than that, it's basically salt. If you can't find non-iodized sea salt, don't worry about it. Typical or just plain non-iodized salt is going to do just fine, okay? And all we're doing is we're taking these shrimp in here, and I'm just gonna sprinkle a little bit of this salt on here. And really overnight, all it's gonna do is toughen these shrimp up. We just stir those around a little bit, and it doesn't matter how big your container is. I don't have an exact measurement for you. I just want to put a little bit of salt on there. Now it's going to draw some water out of these shrimp. You're going to have a little bit of liquid laying in there. You can drain that off or you can leave it. It really doesn't matter. But over the course of an evening, these shrimp will actually toughen up quite well, and they'll fish very well for you. If you have a little bit of dirtier water, or you just want to fish something with a little bit of color, a little bit more UV than the natural UV that these shrimp actually put off, you can simply take some of this pink Boraxo Fire. This is just a non-sulfite based steelhead egg cure that we make at Pautzke's, and it works very well on shrimp and eggs and all kinds of things. And I am not going to put on very much at all. I mean, I want them a little bit pink, but I don't need them to turn extremely dark pink. So I'm just going to stir those around a little bit, and it's just going to give them a really light coating of pink. Now, as those sit overnight, and you could actually, you can use orange as well. I think for chum, you're better off using the pink. You don't necessarily need to use the dark red. I wouldn't go that extreme with it. And again, this is just a very light dusting to give it a little bit of extra color and a little bit of UV if you need to. Believe it or not, these things, and I think in years past, Herzog and I have talked about it time and time again, referencing steelhead. These little shrimp actually have a natural kind of UV in them. When you put them in the water, clear water, sun's hitting them, they kind of have a natural glow to them, which is pretty impressive. So you can fish them raw with a little salt. You can add a little bit of color, but even at this size, this small size of shrimp that we have here is not the size of shrimp that I'm going to want to put on my jig, because it's going to make that jig kind of hang weird, okay? So I can do a couple things. I can cut a small chunk off like this here, and then I can put that on the jig, and that works pretty well. And it's nothing fancy. We're just going to pull that back, and I'm just going to thread that on, and I got that little piece of meat hanging on there. Jig will still perform as it's supposed to, and works pretty well. That is one way to do it. Another way to do it, if I can get that out of the marabou, is I can take one of these and we can cut it lengthwise, okay? And I'll cut it just lengthwise down the middle and make a nice little thin fillet, and I can double that over and I can stick that on the hook, and that also works very well. More times than not, I'm just going to chunk them. Sometimes I like to have a little longer piece kind of hanging out the back as that tail hangs out. Kind of gives it a little bit more action on there. Either way is going to work just fine. You can cut a chunk off, basically cut these smaller ones right in half, or you can cut down the lateral line and separate that fillet and hang that longer piece off the back, and it's a little less weight on it as well. Yeah, for the most part, you get your jig hanging the way it should. If it seems to hang down a little bit too much, you can move your knot and try to get it to be a little more vertical. But you know what? At the end of the day, they're chum, they're aggressive, they like the colors you're giving them. As soon as they smell that shrimp, they're probably more than excited about the free offering, and they're going to grab it. All right, we're going to jump out for a quick break. Hopefully that helps you out a little bit if you have the opportunity to get out there and get some chum over the next few weeks, barring any closures, but give it a go if you have time. We'll jump out for a quick break. We come back, we'll be back in studio with the guys to finish out the show.